what if the biggest thing holding your business back
Yeah.
was something you could actually control?
Yeah.
That's got to be the power of understanding constraints.
Right.
And that's what we're diving into today
Yeah.
on the FBS podcast. We're here to help you,
Absolutely.
especially those of you in the middle of your careers.
Yep.
Find some really practical information
Yeah.
that you can use
Yeah.
to make a real difference in your businesses.
For sure. So it all starts with a shift in perspective, right? We're tackling the theory of constraints today.
Okay.
And we're using a couple of different sources. We've got some notes from The Goal, which is
Great
a
book.
classic business novel. Really
Yeah.
interesting stuff.
Yeah.
We're also going to be pulling from a Forest Business School discussion about the book.
Right. And this one had some
Yes.
some people from the industry in it, right?
Yeah, it was a really interesting mix of folks, actually. There was a sawmill owner,
Oh,
some
neat.
loggers, even a trail builder.
I see.
And they all had kind of different perspectives on how they were using these concepts in their businesses.
That's cool because you can see how it's applied
You can. It's very practical.
in very different businesses. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So one of the most interesting things about the goal, I think, is it challenges assumptions,
Yeah.
right? Like, what is the goal of a business?
It really does.
I think a lot of people just immediately say it's like efficiency,
Exactly.
maximize,
Utilization.
utilization.
But you want to make sure you're using all your resources all the time.
Right, exactly.
But the book makes a really compelling case that that's not really the goal. The true goal of any business is to make money,
That makes sense.
both now
Yeah.
and in the future,
Yeah.
sustainably.
Stay in business.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so it's not just about working hard.
No.
It's about working
so
in a
hard.
way that actually generates a profit, makes money.
Absolutely.
So how do you measure that then?
Well, the book introduces 3 core metrics.
Okay.
And I think these are really helpful for understanding this whole concept.
Okay.
The first one is throughput.
Throughput. Okay.
And that's the rate at which your system, like your business as a whole, generates money through sales.
So it's not just
It's not just about producing.
Producing it. You got
Yeah,
to
that-
sell it. Yeah.
All right.
The second one is inventory.
Okay.
And that's the money that's tied up in things that you plan to sell.
Like-
So all that raw material, the work in progress,
Finished good.
the finished goods.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then the third one is operating expense.
Operating expense. Okay.
And that's basically all the money you spend turning inventory into throughput. So basically all your costs, right?
All your costs, exactly.
That's
So
okay.
if you want to simplify it, it's about maximizing throughput while minimizing inventory and operating expense.
Okay, so it's not just about producing a lot.
No.
You got to keep your costs down.
Right.
And you got to actually sell the stuff.
It all comes down to sales in the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you mentioned system a couple times there.
Mm-hmm.
The book talks a lot about seeing your business as a system.
It does. And I think that's a really powerful way to think about things. Because it helps you see
a bunch of separate pieces.
Exactly how all the different pieces, how they fit together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a key concept in systems thinking is this idea of constraints.
Constraints and bottlenecks.
Well, it's a constraint.
So a constraint is basically anything that limits the overall capacity of your system. And the book calls this a bottleneck.
Like a traffic jam.
Exactly like a traffic jam. You know, you've got all these cars that could be moving, but they're all stuck because of one narrow point.
Right, right.
And in the discussion, somebody made this really great analogy of the slowest hiker on a trail.
I like that.
You know, it doesn't matter how fast everyone else is.
Right.
The slowest person dictates the pace of the whole group.
That's a good analogy.
It is.
So a bottleneck is basically anything that slows down.
Yeah, anything that's holding you back.
The whole process.
From achieving your full potential.
Okay, but how do you find the bottleneck?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, it seems tricky.
It can be really tricky.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's obvious.
Okay.
Like you've got a piece of equipment that's broken down.
Right.
But a lot of times it's something that's more subtle, and you have to really analyze your processes to find it. And here's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
For a lot of small business owners, the bottleneck is actually themselves.
Wow, really?
True.
I can see how that would be hard to admit.
It is, because, as entrepreneurs, we like to think...
Right. We're the ones making it happen.
Exactly. We're the ones doing everything.
Yeah.
But sometimes we're actually the ones holding ourselves back.
Okay, so how do we know?
How do you know? Well, the book and the discussion have some good examples that might help people relate to this.
Okay.
The sawmill owner in the discussion, he said that if he's not there to run the saw, nothing gets produced.
I see.
Even if he's got a backlog of orders.
Yeah.
Even if he's got plenty of logs.
He's the one.
He is the limiting factor.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and the trail builder, I think.
The trail builder, yes.
He had a similar realization, too.
He can only operate one excavator at a time.
Right, and he's got...
Right, even if he's got skilled helpers.
People who can do other stuff.
Yeah, he's the one.
He's the bottleneck.
Who's actually moving the dirt.
Yeah, so it's interesting to think that it could be the owner sometimes.
It often is.
Who's the bottleneck.
Especially in small businesses.
Yeah.
Where you're wearing a lot of hats.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So if you realize that you are the bottleneck, what can you do about it?
That's where the book really gets practical.
Okay.
It outlines this process for addressing constraints.
Okay.
That it calls Goldratt's 5 focusing steps.
5 focusing steps.
Yeah.
All right, let's break that down.
Okay.
What's the first step?
Well, the first step is to identify the constraint.
Right.
Which we've already been talking about.
We've been talking about that.
Okay. You don't know what you're dealing with.
Okay.
The second step is to decide how to exploit the constraint.
Now, exploit...
Yeah.
Sounds kind of harsh. What does that mean?
It just means making sure that bottleneck is never idle.
Yeah.
It's always working on the most important tasks.
So, like, if the sawmill owner is the bottleneck,
right,
he needs to be spending all his time sawing.
Exactly.
Not getting bogged down in paperwork or...
Not answering emails.
Sales calls or whatever.
Exactly. You got to make sure he's actually producing.
Okay.
The third step is to subordinate everything else to the constraint.
Subordinate. Okay.
Basically, make sure no other processes are running faster than the bottleneck can handle.
So, like, don't take on more orders you can saw.
Exactly.
Even if you have plenty of logs.
Yeah, because then you're just going to end up
all day
with a good pile of inventory, and that's costing you money.
Yeah, okay.
So it's about creating that smooth flow through the whole system.
Right. What's step 4?
Step 4 is to elevate the constraint.
Elevate.
Yeah. Yep. So basically, if you've done everything you can to optimize the bottleneck,
and it's still holding you back, you might need to invest in actually increasing its capacity.
So for the sawmill, that might mean... buying a faster saw.
Buying a faster saw, training somebody else
to
run the existing one.
Who can saw.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So you're actually investing in making that bottleneck.
Removing that.
Less of a bottleneck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. What about step 5?
Step 5 is go back to step 1.
Go back to step 1.
Because here's the thing.
Okay.
Once you've broken one constraint, there's always going to be another one waiting.
Oh, there's always another constraint.
There's always another bottleneck.
Okay.
So it's this continuous process of improvement.
You never
reach a point where there are no constraints.
It's like those old video games, right?
Exactly.
You beat one boss. And there's a bigger, tougher one.
There's always another one waiting.
Yeah. Okay. I like that analogy.
It is a good analogy.
So the discussion had some examples, right, of how these 5 focusing steps could actually be applied.
Real world examples.
In real life. So the sawmill owner. He was talking about training.
Yeah, he was working on training his employee to be able to saw.
Okay.
So that would increase his capacity.
Right, because then he wouldn't have to do all of it himself.
Exactly.
And the trail builder, I think.
The trail builder, he was talking about investing.
He was going to get another excavator.
But he also pointed out that, you know, even with more equipment, finding people who have the skills.
Yeah. Finding skilled people.
To do high-quality trail work.
Yeah. Okay.
That was still a major constraint for him.
Right. So it's not always about equipment.
Not always.
It could be people, too.
It could be people. It could be...
your systems. It could be all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the loggers.
Yeah.
In the discussion, they were talking about...
how they're constantly working.
Minimizing downtime, right?
Yeah, minimizing downtime.
Like weather and equipment repairs.
Yeah.
I think markets
shifting, yeah.
Yeah, all those things.
So, you know, you're never going to get rid of those things.
Right, you can't control that.
But you can minimize that
try to mitigate
downtime.
The impact,
Now, the sawmill owner's story kind of brought up something that I think a lot of people struggle with.
What's that?
And that is that sometimes we make things more complicated, but they need to be.
We absolutely do.
He was talking about whether some of his more complicated, higher-priced products.
Yeah, like the custom stuff.
Yeah, were really worth the effort.
Yeah, he was questioning whether those high-value products
were actually as profitable as focusing on the simpler products that had lower operating expenses. Because sometimes that complexity adds cost without adding a corresponding increase in price.
We all have a tendency to overcomplicate things.
We do. We like to.
Sometimes the simplest thing
we like to think
are more clever than we are sometimes.
And the notes from the goal talk about this as inertia.
Inertia, yeah.
Now, what do they mean by that?
It's this tendency to stick with what's familiar, even when it's not optimal.
Oh, okay.
So we get stuck in these routines.
Even when,
And we keep doing things the same way.
It's not the best way.
Even when we know there might be a better way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to break those routines.
It is. It's comfortable.
Yeah. You get used to it.
And, we're creatures of habit. We like what we know.
And the discussion had somebody actually quoted Jim Clear. Oh, yeah, I remember that.
In the long run.
He said, in the long run, prioritization beats efficiency.
Prioritization beats efficiency.
Yeah.
So it's not just about doing things efficiently. It's about making sure you're doing
the right thing.
The right things.
Yeah. Okay. That can be really efficient at doing the wrong things.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's not going to help you.
So the discussion had this great example of somebody breaking out of that inertia.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm thinking of the logger who just started a job without even asking his dad.
Yeah, just because it needed to be done.
Yeah.
He didn't.
And it turned out to be the right decision.
Right. It did. It challenged that assumption.
Yeah.
That the father needed to be involved.
Yeah, it was kind of an old way of doing things.
In every decision.
And he just did it.
Yeah, he was proactive.
And it worked.
And it worked out.
So I guess sometimes you just got to trust your gut.
Sometimes you do.
And take action.
Right. You got to be willing to break out of those ingrained habits and say, you know what, I'm just going to try this and see what happens.
But the discussion also talked about how, external factors can create constraints too.
They absolutely can.
Right.
And this is something that we all have to deal with.
Market fluctuations.
To some extent. Weather. Market fluctuations, regulations.
Tough to deal with.
They are, yeah.
And the loggers were talking about how these external constraints can make it really hard to optimize.
They make it hard to plan.
Yeah.
Because you're constantly having to adjust.
Because the things outside of your control.
What the weather's going to be.
Yeah, you can't control the weather.
You can't control the market.
Exactly.
And the logger in Maine, I thought he had a great point. He said, even if I had the most efficient logging operation in the world.
The most efficient operation in the world.
If there's no market for the wood.
If there's no market for your product.
It doesn't matter. Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
You're still not going to make money.
So what can you do about that?
Well, you can't control everything.
Yeah.
But you can control how you react.
Okay.
So building some flexibility into your system.
Okay.
Diversifying your offerings.
Right.
Those are things that can help.
Right. So if one market's down,
mitigate the risk.
You have other options.
Exactly. So sometimes it's better to stay nimble and focus on what you do well.
Okay.
Even if it means not growing as fast.
Okay. So the trail builder.
The trail builder. Yeah. He's a good example of that.
He's kind of found his niche.
He's found his niche.
And he does what he's good at.
And he chooses.
Even if it means turning down some work.
To focus on that.
Okay.
Even if it means turning down work.
All right. So understanding your constraints.
Yeah.
I guess both internal.
Both internal and external.
And external is key.
Absolutely.
And the discussion leader, he talked about constraints, even in terms of his own time.
Oh, yeah. He was talking about how he used to be on all these committees.
Yeah, a lot of committees.
Yeah.
And he realized that.
And he realized.
So it was just draining his time.
It was draining his time and energy and preventing him.
He was the bottleneck in his own workflow.
From getting the really important stuff done.
Yeah. So it's hard to say no sometimes.
It is.
But you got to prioritize.
So sometimes you got to.
And eliminate the no.
Yeah.
The stuff that isn't essential.
To the things that aren't helping you move towards your goals.
So he found that saying no to those committees
freed
him up
to
do
freed him up.
More important things.
Focus on the things.
So he was actually getting more done.
That really mattered.
By doing less.
Exactly.
I don't like that.
It's about ruthlessly prioritizing and focusing on.
Ruthlessly.
Yeah.
I like that word.
You got to be ruthless with your time.
Okay.
And your energy.
And I think it's easy to get caught up.
Oh, it's so easy.
In being busy.
It is. We live in a culture that glorifies.
You got to be doing all the time.
But that's not always.
You're not working hard enough if you're not.
The best strategy.
Being constantly busy.
And I'm thinking of that logger who was cutting timber.
Yeah.
He was cutting timber.
Before he even had buyers.
Yeah,
he was so focused on keeping his crew busy.
Right.
Keeping his equipment running.
Our equipment running. But he ended up with a huge pile of inventory.
So if nobody's buying it.
And no cash flow.
It's not doing any good.
Exactly. He was creating a bottleneck for himself.
He was just producing.
By producing more.
More than the market could handle.
Than the market could handle, yeah.
So he was being efficient.
It was a classic example of efficiency.
But not effective.
Over-effectiveness.
Yeah, okay.
Sometimes slowing down.
Sometimes you got to slow down.
And being more strategic about production.
Yeah.
Can actually be more profitable.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It reminds me
of
those stories about
PBs, you know?
Yeah.
They come out with a product and then it just flops.
They spend all their time and energy developing.
Yeah, because nobody
this amazing product
wants it.
And then
it might be a great product.
Nobody buys it.
But if there's no demand,
it might be a great product.
It doesn't matter.
But if there's no demand, yeah, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, okay.
It all comes back to
aligning your actions with
aligning your actions.
Making money.
With the goal of making money.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so
and I think the discussion really highlighted how important it is to adapt.
Okay. Especially in an industry like forestry where things are always changing.
There's so many things are constantly changing.
You know, they're dealing with
you've got
shifting markets, new regulations, weather.
It's a lot to juggle.
It is.
It's true.
And those external factors, they can impact any business, really.
Yeah, any business could have these external factors.
So it's really about
I think the logger whose father insisted on being involved.
Yeah, he was a bottleneck.
In every part of the business.
In their own business.
That's a great example of how sometimes you have to...
Sometimes you got to
challenge those old habits.
Those ingrained habits.
So he took a risk by starting that job without his dad's... He took a risk.
Complete involvement.
And it ended up...
And it showed.
Showing that the business could function.
Right. That things could move forward.
Without the father's constant oversight.
So I guess it's a reminder that sometimes we create our own constraints. By clinging to those old...
By clinging to outdated...
ways of doing things.
Yeah. Okay. So sometimes you gotta...
Sometimes you gotta let go.
You gotta break free and embrace...
Embrace a new way?
A new way of doing things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. It was like he was afraid to let go a little bit.
Yeah, he was holding on too tight.
Yeah.
And that was actually creating a bottleneck.
Right.
For the whole business.
So sometimes you gotta...
be willing to
loosen the reins a little bit.
Delegate.
Yeah. And trust.
Yeah. Trust your people.
Trust your people.
Yeah. And that can be hard.
It can be really hard.
Especially when you're used to doing everything yourself.
Yeah, you built this thing.
But sometimes it's necessary.
Yeah.
If you want to grow.
If you want to grow, yeah.
If you want to reach that next level.
You got to let go.
You got to let go of some of that control.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the theory of constraints.
Yes.
I want to leave you with this thought.
Okay.
What if the key to unlocking your business's full potential is in doing less?
It's a powerful idea.
Right. We always think we got to be doing more.
We do.
More.
More.
But what if it's actually about doing
less?
But doing the right things really well.
Exactly. It's about focusing on those things that really move the needle.
Okay, so by understanding your constraints
and embracing constraints,
you can actually create a more efficient,
a more
profitable, and ultimately, I think, a more
fulfilling business. Yeah, because you're not constantly stressed out.
Absolutely stressed.
Trying to do everything.
You're focused on what matters.
Exactly.
And for those of you who want to explore these ideas further, the Forest Business School has a lot of great resources.
Lots of great resources.
Like workshops, coaching to help you actually apply these principles in your own business.
So it's not just theory. They can actually help you figure out how to do this.
Taking action.
All right, we'll put a link in the show notes.
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
On the FBS podcast.
Hey, this is Steve Bick with the Forest Business School. Thanks for listening to the FBS podcast, and I hope you will subscribe. The truth is, these deep dives barely scratch the surface of some of the topics we cover in the Forest Business School programs, and the podcast is a way of reaching a wider audience. Check out my website at vtfbs.com for more information. Reach out if you want to talk about one of the FBS programs or have custom training or project needs that you'd like to discuss. Again, thanks for listening to the FBS podcast.